Now, as regulatory decisions loom, the fate of Eskom's coal-fired power station hangs in the balance. With potential consequences on the horizon for their pollution practices, what lies ahead is a delicate balance between economic stability and environmental integrity. Joining us to unpack this in greater detail is energy writer for Business Day, Denene Erasmus. Denene, always a pleasure. Good afternoon.
Hi, and again, thanks for having me.
All right, Denene, let's unpack the process that's currently underway here. We know that there's a report that's supposed to come out, an expert panel that's been looking at emissions around Eskom. Just help us understand where we are.
So this is actually an appeal that has been pending for about 2 years now. Eskom, like all other big polluting companies in South Africa, does have to comply with the country's minimum emissions standards, which is regulated according to the National Environmental Management Act. But many of its power stations do not comply currently with these minimum emission standards, and some postponements were granted in the past and are currently in place. For some stations, those postponements have lapsed. For other stations, the postponements will lapse sometime next year. And the decision that was being appealed not only by Eskom but also by environmental groups, this decision by the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and Environment, if that was to be implemented today, it would result in Eskom having to almost immediately switch down about 15,000 megawatt of generation capacity from its coal-fired fleet. And that would rise to about 30,000 megawatt by April next year, when some of the current postponements for some of these stations lapses. So it is very hard to imagine that there would not be some accommodation made, because I think it would obviously be quite disastrous for the country and the economy if we had to suddenly switch off such a large share of the total installed capacity of coal-fired power stations. But because of the competing appeals that there were to this original decision by the department, the minister did appoint this expert panel, which has now already delivered their advice to the appeals directorate in this matter. And that recommendation is set to be delivered by the appeals directorate to the Minister Barbara Creecy sometime next week, around the 16th of April, and then soon after that we should know what, based on then the recommendation from the panel, what the minister's decision is in this appeals case.
I must ask you, Denene, here, when we think of the RRP 2023, one of the big criticisms that have come out here is that we have every intention of still being reliant on coal-fired power stations. And so what this does tell me is that we could be in a bit of a fix here, depending on what is in this report, and what comes out of the expert panel here. We could find ourselves where government has kind of worked against government. Just keen to get your thoughts there.
It's hard to anticipate what the expert panel would have advised the minister, but I think if we look at some of the appeals that were lodged by environmental groups, it included that they wanted to see much firmer details on what possible postponements there could be for the decommissioning of some of the older and more polluting stations. Because Eskom did apply to be, for some of these older stations, to be exempt from the minimum emission standards. And I think maybe what we will see is that Eskom will maybe be compelled to put the details on the table, because there is still no clear and final answer for the country on exactly which stations and for how long decommissioning on these stations will be postponed. And so that's maybe something that might come out of this process.
Another interesting, I think, aspect here is, Dean, we often speak of, the necessary or the necessity of having less coal within our energy mix based on greenhouse gas emissions. But there's also a real human and economic cost here that I think some of the environmental groups have made. Let's just talk about that, which should be, I think, closer to home as well.
So one of the reports that were cited in the appeals that were filed by environmental groups, and they were being represented by the Centre for Environmental Rights, did state that if nothing happens, if Eskom is not through these regulations really compelled to act fast on its emissions, the status quo in terms of emissions could result in about 80,000 deaths due to pollution from 2025 onwards until these stations do finally get decommissioned. So yes, there's definitely that massive human toll that must be considered, and then the economic cost of these health impacts that run into the billions of rands that should also be considered as it is a real economic cost. And I think what we saw last year in the decision that Minister Creasy took with the temporary solution that was implemented at Kusile Power Station, which then resulted in Kusile having much higher levels of sulfur dioxide emissions for about the 12 months while the temporary stack solution remains in place. We did see there that the minister did very much consider and mention in her decision the impact that this would have on human life and on the health of the communities around this station that will be directly affected. Of course, we did see there that the economic imperative of having that generation capacity online sooner by about 12 months did weigh heavier as the decision did go towards Eskom. So that is maybe some indication of what we can expect with this decision as well, that while there's the human cost and the cost of health impacts will influence the decision, that the larger cost of being without so much generation capacity almost immediately is likely to outweigh, at least in the short term.
Well, Denise, all we have time for this afternoon. Thank you so much for speaking to us on this. That was energy writer for Business Day, Denene Erasmus.